Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the University of Minnesota China Center's Considering China webinar series. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I direct the China Center. Today's webinar is Between Cooperation and Conflict, Charting a Durable Path for the Future of U.S.-China Relations. I thank you for joining us today and your support of the China Center in this webinar series. Your generosity makes programs like this possible. We particularly like to express our thank you to Kaimei and Joseph Terry for their backing of this program, and we invite you to support our mission and give to the China Center through the link on the webinar announcement or on our website. At the end of the program, we'll do Q&A questions that you submit through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And if you have any questions at all or having technical difficulties, you're welcome to use the chat function, but please don't post your questions there. Today, we're delighted to welcome Ryan Haas. He's a senior fellow and the Michael H. Armacost Chair in Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where he holds a joint appointment to the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He's also interim Chen Fu and Sili Gu Chair in Taiwan Studies. His research focus is on enhancing policy development on the pressing political, economic, and security challenges facing the United States in East Asia. Welcome, Ryan, and we'll let you get started, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Well, Director Brzezinski, thank you for having me and welcoming me to the University of Minnesota community. It's really an honor for me to be associated with this speaker series, and I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have. In the age of COVID that we live in, I am literally trapped inside the Beltway bubble. And so it's going to be great to hear the reactions, the thoughts, the comments, the questions that we get to. But to help get us started, I thought I would spend a few minutes exploring whether it will be possible for the United States and China to chart a durable path forward to coexist amidst intensifying competition or not. And I will also try to handicap the risk and likelihood of conflict between our two countries. And at the risk of spoiling the punchline, my basic conclusion is that failure to chart a durable path forward would be catastrophic and devastating for both countries. Both would suffer, neither would gain, neither would be able to achieve their own national ambitions in a conflictual relationship with the other. So the starting point of my analysis is that we just simply have to figure out a way forward, a way to coexist amidst competition. Not necessarily because we like China or China likes us, but because neither side realistically will be able to impose its will on the other. Neither will be able to prevail over the other, and both will be impacted for good or ill by the actions of the other. But the challenge is that friction has been rising in the U.S.-China relationship for at least the past decade. And it's on a troubling trajectory. As someone who has had the privilege of participating in meetings between our presidents in the past, I'm personally familiar with the intensity of the competition that exists in the relationship. At the most fundamental level, both countries believe that their models, their systems, their governance systems, economic models are best suited for the 21st century. Both believe they're entitled to a leadership role in Asia and in the world. And both believe that they should benefit from the pull of power that comes from the demonstration of their ongoing success. And both are determined to find ways to strengthen their ability to compete against the other. And in recent years, both have been making fewer and fewer efforts to conceal the frustrations that they have with the other side. And in addition, I would argue that there are at least three additional factors that are making this moment that we are in right now feel more tensely acute than it has in the past. The first is the simple fact that China has emerged as a near-peer competitor of the United States. This was the language I believe that the Director of National Intelligence used yesterday in her congressional testimony. And the fact is that in 2008, on the eve of the global financial crisis, America's economy was at least 4 times larger than China's. Today, it's around 35% larger. Whereas in 2008, America's military capabilities significantly outpaced China's. Now, China poses a very stiff test for American military capabilities, particularly in the Western Pacific. Whereas China was a burgeoning regional power in 2008, it now is a bona fide global power with investments and initiatives on every continent, growing weight within international institutions, and growing ambitions to bend rules and norms to suit its preferences. So that's the first change that I think that we are experiencing. The second is that Xi Jinping has imprinted his personality on China's approach at home and abroad. In 2008, China under Hu Jintao was committed to reform and opening at home, to a policy abroad of hiding its capabilities and biding its time, or Tao Guangyang Hui. And in practical terms, this meant that China sought to avoid unnecessary international entanglements or responsibilities or burdens, that it wanted to maintain a rather benign external environment, and it was focused foremost on spurring its own development at home. Now, of course, China was rapidly modernizing its military at that same time, but the point of focus was on its own domestic development. Now, by contrast, China is promoting a domestic economic model of dual circulation, which is intended in large part to reduce dependence on foreign sources of supply, or what Xi Jinping has referred to as hostile external forces. Beijing has shed its modesty in foreign affairs with a sort of sense of proud assertion of China seeking to reclaim its historic position as the leading power in Asia and a leading power on the world stage. China has stirred up waters, literally, along its periphery, as it has sought to strengthen its assertions of control over contested territories that it claims as its own. It has absorbed Hong Kong, launched a massive campaign to tighten control over all aspects of life inside China, none more so vividly than in Xinjiang. And with the Belt and Road Initiative, China has launched the most ambitious foreign policy project of any country since at least the Marshall Plan that the United States initiated at the end of World War II. And Beijing also has adopted a sort of a posture or a mantra of never taking a punch without throwing a counterpunch. And we've seen this over and over, not just in the U.S. China context, but also in China's relations with Australia, with South Korea, and with the European Union and everyone else. And so quite apart from the question of whether China's foreign policy ambitions or overall national ambitions have shifted under Xi, the manner and tenor by which China has been pursuing its ambitions has become much more muscular in recent years. And then the third discontinuity I would suggest is that China's rise has coincided with a period of severe disruption in the United States. We are going through what many people call the fourth industrial revolution, which has dramatically altered the nature of work and where jobs are in our economy. Our country's going through a pretty significant demographic transition right now. Our politics have become much more fractious, and particularly at the national level, where I live in Washington, D.C., just highly contentious. And on top of that, the United States has experienced a series of global setbacks, from the September 11th attacks, the global war on terror, our conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Arab Spring, the refugee flows from the Middle East into Europe, which fueled populism, to the rise of President Trump, and the retreat in recent years of America from its traditional leadership role on the world stage. And so we've experienced this near perfect storm of events at the same time that China has been surging forward. And this hasn't sat well with many people in the United States. As we survey the world, we're used to being reminded of our strengths, not our setbacks. This is a theme that I think President Trump seized on in 2016 when he was running for president. And he really fixated on this idea of America growing weak. And he promised that he would act strong where others before him had been timid. And other political commentators, including people like Karl Rove, have identified China as a top issue that could lead to a reordering of political alignments inside the United States. So as China has risen in prominence within our political system, so too has demand for explanations about what's going on. And a handful of explanations have emerged in recent years to try to distill and give meaning to this shift that we're all feeling. There are a couple that have been more prominent than others. The first is this idea that the past American approach to China has failed, that during past administrations, the United States was overly welcoming of China's rise, that we had this gauzy hope of turning China into a democracy, that eventually China and the United States would converge and China would become more like us, and that bet just failed. And that instead of curbing China and seeking to stunt its growth, the United States allowed and enabled an authoritarian challenger to emerge. And this is a view that Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo and many others in the last administration espoused. And their general orientation was that unless China is stopped, it will impose its vision and its values on the rest of the world and imperil America's leadership role and its way of life in the process. And this led to a feeling of China, as an existential threat, a challenge to the existence of America as we know it. And in that context, when China is seen as an existential threat, compromise isn't really an available option. There are winners and there are losers, and the United States must win. It cannot afford to compromise because compromise is concession, concession is accommodation, and accommodation is weak. So that was the first big argument that emerged in recent years. The second is this idea that there are mechanical features of relative shifts in power. And Graham Allison at Harvard University, John Mearsheimer in Chicago, and others have really put flesh to this idea that China will act as a power maximizing rising power, and that there will be tension between a rising power and an existing power. These arguments, they often lead us to the conclusion that one side's gains are the other's losses. And if you accept this mindset of a impending great power collision, then you don't want to passively stand by and wait for the collision. You want to accelerate into it and be the one that is asserting rather than the one that is asserted upon. And then the third big argument that has come forward is this idea that there is a irreconcilability of China's national ambitions and America's vital interests. And within this school of thought, there is a broadly held view that China's ambitions are so big and so in tension with American values that we just simply cannot coexist within the same international system. In this view, China's leaders will naturally be allergic to the liberal nature of the existing international order and will want to chip away at, erode, and eventually end the prevalence and reach of the liberal international order. These analyst views often also are colored by a belief or a faith that a rising power's character at home is a precursor of its conduct abroad. And as they have watched China increase its repression inside China, they have grown wary about what this may foretell for what China will seek to do on the world stage when it gains the power and the confidence to do so. Now, I must admit that I don't find any of these three big arguments particularly persuasive. The argument about past policy failures leading to this Frankenstein of authoritarianism that could, displace and end America as we know it feels a bit oversold for my tastes. The first reason why is because many past policy practitioners vigorously dispute the notion that past policy was focused on some hopefulness of China becoming a democracy. They believe that they had a much more cold-eyed calculation of what China was, that they had lived in China, seen it up close, understood what they were dealing with, and never held such rose-tinted hopes. Second, the idea that America permitted China's rise, I think, belies a certain arrogance that I'm uncomfortable with. It suggests that previous administrations made a choice and chose wrong. My own experience is that China represents 1/5 of humanity, 1 out of every 5 people on Earth, 1.4 billion people. They're proud, industrious, hardworking people located at the heart of the most vibrant economic region in the world. And I think that it's really mostly through their own efforts that they rose. The United States certainly created a benign external environment through our security presence in Asia. The United States did welcome China into the World Trade Organization. So the United States plays a role in the story, but it wasn't a turnkey role where the United States opened the door and China became a major power as a consequence. The argument about irreconcilable and mechanical stresses resulting from shifts in relative power also doesn't sit very comfortably with me. I'm not yet persuaded that the Peloponnesian Wars in 400 BC are the best historical analogy of the current moment in the U.S.-China relationship. I think that this argument also undervalues the role that a series of decisions by previous leaders in the United States and China have had on the direction of the relationship, and the possibility that different decisions by different leaders could lead the relationship in a different direction. I also, I struggle with the idea that two nuclear-armed powers with clarity of understanding of the destructive nature of any conflict between them will be solely power maximizing and indifferent to risk in pursuit of relative gain over the other. And my sense is that these arguments have diminishing purchase with the incoming or with the current administration in the White House than they did with the previous one. And then the third argument about irreconcilability of US and Chinese ambitions, it's an argument that is sort of baked into this idea of deep ideological struggle between our two countries. My sense is that this argument has more appeal at the left and right ends of the American political spectrum than it does at the center. At the center of the political spectrum, you see people like Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell, two prominent figures in China policy in the White House today, talking about the need for the United States and China to coexist and to compete without catastrophe. And I think that's generally where the Biden White House is on a lot of these issues. But even in spite of the shortcomings I've identified with some of these explanations of the U.S.-China relationship, I have to acknowledge that they have been pretty sticky. They have been very compelling to a lot of people in the United States, and they've had a huge influence on the nature of our discussions about the U.S.-China relationship. The one common thread that all three of those explanations have is they present China as being on an inexorable rise. They suggest that China's rise is a risk to the United States. They lead to the conclusion that China has to be stopped, and that if it is not, America and America's place in the world will suffer significantly. I think that this misdiagnoses the moment a bit. And in the process, it sort of points American policy in a counterproductive direction, pushing us into a posture of reactively, anxiously, defensively responding to every Chinese initiative everywhere in the world. And I don't think that anxiety and insecurity are attractive in diplomacy any more than they are in human-to-human relations. They're not effective at pulling other countries closer to us, giving other countries confidence that we have a theory of the case and that we have a proactive agenda for advancing it. And so this was the kernel of an idea that led me to write the book Stronger, which was published recently by Yale University Press. As context, I have to acknowledge that the book was written in 2019. I finished writing it in January 2020, around the same time that Joe Biden was finishing in 4th place in the Iowa caucus. The outcome of the Democratic primary was far from certain. The outcome of the 2020 presidential election was a coin toss at that time. But part of my goal in writing the book was to try to make a case that the United States needs to remember that we are the stronger power in the U.S.-China relationship, and we should get back to acting like it. And the reason I think so is because I believe that confidence is the wellspring of patience and steadiness. It allows us to resist alarmism and anxieties, and instead deal with challenges posed by China with a certain Midwestern firmness and sturdiness. And the more I researched the book, the more confident I became in making this case, because the United States really does have significant strengths in its competition with China. We have a historically unmatched network of alliances that span the globe. No other country in the history of humankind has had this type of alliance network. The United States plays a central role in international institutions. We play a big role in selecting the leaders and setting the agenda in these institutions. The United States has a unique capacity for innovation. We have deep and liquid capital pools, relatively efficient allocation of capital, predictable legal system, protections of intellectual property. And we need to remember that. No other country has that sort of amalgamation of factors that the United States has. The United States has economic weight. We remain an economy that is $7 trillion larger than China's. And even as China's economy has risen significantly over recent decades, it's worth bearing in mind that America's share of global GDP is roughly the same today as it was in the early 1990s, at the height of America's unipolar moment. America hasn't shed its share of global GDP. China has accumulated a greater share, a bigger slice of the pie, as Japan's and the European Union's slice of the pie has shrunk during that period. The United States enjoys food and energy security. We have benign borders. Mexico and Canada are pretty good neighbors to have, relatively speaking. And we also need to have confidence in the fact that we have resilient and adaptable political institutions. We've seen that just in the past couple of months. And while China's strengths get a lot of attention, they also have pretty significant vulnerabilities. China in the coming years and decades will face stiff economic headwinds. They are on a demographic downslope. Debt levels have been piling up in pockets of the economy. China is struggling to make productivity gains, and it's really having a hard time unlocking domestic consumption. More and more people feel like they need to save for a rainy day because they don't have confidence in the social safety net being there to catch them if and when they fall. China is experiencing a concentration of political power around a very dominant leader in their system right now. And as a consequence, it's becoming harder and harder for Chinese officials to report bad news to the top, to make course corrections when previous judgments turn out to not be profitable for them. And it's also making it more risky for local leaders to experiment with different policy experiments, which was really a major element of China's rise from the local experimentation in Shenzhen and the scaling of some of those ideas to the national level. China has challenges with national cohesion. We see this in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, in Tibet, and elsewhere. And many people make the case that China is buying itself future challenges and future problems in this space with the repressive way in which it is seeking to crack down on dissent or challenges, perceived or otherwise, to the firm control of the Chinese Communist Party. Whereas the United States has food and energy security, China does not. China relies upon imports to feed its people and fuel its economy. It does not have the naval capacity, at least not yet, to protect its sea lines of communication to the Middle East, which is a real vulnerability. China also has the toughest geography of any country in the world. It has 14 neighbors, 5 of which it has territorial disputes with, 4 of which maintain nuclear weapons, none of which will allow themselves to be subordinate to China. None of their identities will allow for that. So a confident view of America's relative position, I hope, over time will help us get back to playing offense in this relationship, investing in our own strengths and forcing China to react to our moves, which is, I believe, where we want to be. It's the sweet spot for the United States and the U.S.-China relationship. And in my book, I try to unpack this idea that the U.S.-China relationship is both competitive and interdependent. These are 2 features of the relationship that exist alongside each other. And this is intended to be, a modest departure from the idea that the United States-China relationship is a great power competition. This was an idea that the Trump administration put at the center of its foreign policy and its national security strategy in 2017. To be clear, I do believe and accept that competition is a defining feature of the U.S.-China relationship. I expect it will be well into the future. The simple reality is that we have different governance and economic systems. We have different regional and global ambitions, and we just have fundamental differences of views on important issues, including things like the balance between individual liberties and social stability, the role of the state in the economy, distribution of power in the global system, and on specific issues like Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, human rights, and other things. But at the same time, we have to understand the nature of the international system. My view is that the United States and China are two unique powers in that system, that both countries are racing ahead of everyone else in terms of overall national power. And year by year, the gap between the United States and China and everyone else appears to be widening. The United States and China are the only two countries in the international system that have major economies, large populations, global interests, and major militaries. No other countries that I can think of fit that description. At the same time, our two countries have this really dense, thick web of relationships that have built up across the Pacific over the past 40 years. There is now nearly $700 billion in two-way trade between our two countries. And if you think about that, that's almost $2 billion a day that is crossing the Pacific. Additionally, American companies operating in China, selling into the China market, generate something like $400 billion in annual revenue. There is integrated knowledge production between the West Coast of the United States and the East Coast of China. There's a reason why the Zoom technology we're using today it's an American company that uses Chinese talent to create this wonderful information technology. The other fact that's inescapable is that it's going to be very hard for either of our countries to grapple with many of the global challenges that we both confront unless we're both moving in a similar direction. And this is true with climate change, with global public health, with the global economy, with issues like Iran. We are just simply going to be impacted for good or ill by the actions of the other. And focusing on competition without accounting for this interdependence, I think creates a skewed or imprecise picture of what's really happening in the relationship. And it matters for a couple of reasons. First, it feeds an impulse to view every Chinese action everywhere in the world as a threat to the United States, irrespective of whether the Chinese action in question implicates our vital interest or not. It causes us to treat other countries around the world as pawns in this great power competition, rather than viewing them as partners with agendas of our own and a relationship that we need to cultivate on its own merits. And we see this manifesting in things like having our previous Secretary of State traveling around the world, giving speeches warning about China's evil intentions, never mind the fact that many of the countries to whom he was lecturing have their own deep histories with China and don't really need our lectures. But it also has effects for us at home. It creates pressure to mobilize American society to counter the threat. And if we rerun some of the patterns of the early Cold War years, we'll find ourselves bloating our defense budget, stoking nationalism, and struggling with racism. And my argument is that we shouldn't go down this path, that it's an unprofitable path for us to pursue, and that we would do much better by nurturing our own strength and putting pressure on China to respond to us rather than vice versa. The hard reality is that the United States doesn't get to choose China's regime type. U.S. policymakers don't get to determine the size of China's economy. We're not capable of pushing China back within its borders and having China live in isolation. So part of the work that I'm hoping my book will do is to help us concentrate on the things that we can control as opposed to those that we cannot. And our principal competitive advantage with China is our domestic dynamism, our global alliance network, and our global prestige. We control these advantages. China does not. So I hope and I believe that our time, our focus, our resources can most impactfully be spent investing in these areas rather than reacting to anything that China is doing. The more we live by our values, tighten our bonds with our allies, lead through the power of our example, the stronger the position that we will be in to compete with China over time. Now, to be clear, this does not mean that we should give China a pass on what it does at home or how it acts towards its neighbors. We should not be silent on issues like Xinjiang. That's not who we are or who we've been as American citizens. We have a long history of speaking up and standing up for values that we believe in and ideals that we believe in, and I think that we should continue to do so. But I mentioned that just to make the point that we are locked into a serious competition with China. It's one that holds the risk of bringing us into conflict with each other if it's not managed well. I've often been asked recently whether or not this is too late. The book arrived a couple of years too late. If both sides have already cast each other as the enemy and are incapable of changing their minds towards the other. And there are no doubt constituencies in both countries that look at the other with hostile intent and believe that the other is an enemy that must be defeated. But I don't yet believe that those views are decisive at the leader level. Xi Jinping talks about time and momentum being on China's side, but he also warns of the United States being the biggest risk to China achieving its goals. And this suggests to me that Beijing is not seeking a huge collision with the United States. It recognizes its vulnerabilities, and it doesn't want to find itself in conflict with the United States. Now, an argument certainly could be made that China's actions are inviting confrontation, but I don't think that is their plan or their interpretation of their own behavior. And by the same token in reverse, President Biden has been very disciplined in talking about China as a competitor and not as an adversary, not as an enemy. And this is it's a small distinction, but an important one. A competitor is someone that you try to outpace. An enemy is someone that you feel the need to harm in order to protect yourself. So my view is that President Biden is not looking for a cosmic clash. I don't have a sense that the American people are eager to see a cosmic clash between the United States and China either. At the same time, neither side can escape the relationship, and neither sees direct conflict as a path towards achievement of national ambitions. So I don't think it's too late yet. But I have to be honest, there are considerable risks that need to be managed. And if they're not, they could tip us into conflict with each other. I see 4 potential pathways to conflict. One is if China challenges the credibility of US security commitments. If there is second is if there is an unplanned encounter, a collision between US and Chinese military assets that leads to a spiral of escalation. There is the risk of failure by both sides to manage emerging technology that could lead to an acceleration of the velocity and lethality of any incident. And then the fourth would be if China were to attempt to obstruct America's access to international waters and airspace in Asia. So my hope is that a clear-eyed assessment of these risks will prompt both sides to really invest in serious efforts to reduce risk and develop crisis management mechanisms. And relative to the architecture that was built up during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, these efforts in the U.S.-China relationship were very immature. We haven't made the progress that we need to. But the challenge is that neither side's security establishment wants to be seen as the ardent suitor or to voluntarily relinquish capabilities that it believes it may need at some point in the future to contest the other. And there's also a bit of a misalignment in priorities around risk reduction. The United States wants unimpeded access anywhere that international law allows us to operate. China would like to push our operations further from its shores. The United States wants operational flexibility. China wants greater operational transparency about where we are operating, when, and why. And given just these asymmetries, the only way that I see for us to be able to make progress in reducing risk and building crisis management mechanisms is if both leaders prioritize it as something that just has to get done, and tell their security establishments to get it done. This is what President Obama and President Xi did in 2014 when they established rules of the road for when our vessels encounter each other at sea or our planes encounter each other in the air. And that this is where we need to go. So there's also, of course, the risk of Taiwan. I think Taiwan is the most proximate issue that could bring the United States and China into conflict with each other. The commander of American forces in the Pacific recently testified to Congress that he could foresee the United States and China bumping into each other over Taiwan within the next 6 years. This was, a statement that drew a lot of attention and a lot of concern. My own view is that Beijing would still prefer to achieve its objectives without resort to force if it can. And it has a strong incentive to try to avoid a conflict. If China were to use military instruments to compel unification with Taiwan, it very likely would find itself in conflict with the United States, which would be a conflict that would be difficult to control, either in terms of escalation or geography. China would poison its standing in the world. It would alert the rest of the region to the aggressiveness of their ambitions. It would lead to massive capital outflows and a huge hit on China's economy. And it would create vulnerabilities for China, given its dependence on imports of food and fuel to sustain itself. So it's not a surprise to me that China has looked for other options other than a military strike to try to compel unification. They often talk about when the melon is ripe, it will fall from the stem. What they are talking about is trying to compel the people of Taiwan to believe that their only path to peace and security and prosperity is to welcome the embrace of China. And they are using a process of coercion without violence as sort of a Goldilocks solution between doing nothing and using military force. This isn't a future hypothetical. This is happening now. We see it with China's efforts to isolate Taiwan diplomatically, to squeeze them economically, to conduct military operations around the east, west, south, and north of Taiwan through their cyber operations, their influence operations. The people of Taiwan are, they're facing stress. And it calls for us as friends of Taiwan to find practical ways to strengthen the people of Taiwan's confidence in their future, helping them diversify trade ties, remain at the cutting edge of innovation, and earn dignity and respect on the world stage. Taiwan, I think, is one of the clearest examples of the zero-sum nature of some of the issues in the U.S.-China relationship, where it is very difficult to find some middle point or compromise point. Zero-sum issues in the U.S.-China relationship command a lot of our attention, and they should, because they often involve war and peace issues. But even as important as those issues are, I don't think we can allow them to eclipse all other aspects of the relationship. Because the truth is there are also parts of the relationship that are positive sum or negative sum, meaning that both the United States and China will benefit together or be harmed and lose, depending upon how the issues are managed. Secretary Blinken recently talked about America's top 8 foreign policy priorities in a speech he gave at the State Department last month. 7 of those were transnational or global challenges. One of them was geographic, and that was China. I mention this because the reality is that it's going to be really hard for us to deal with some of these challenges if we can't find ways for China to contribute alongside us in dealing with them. And our ability to encourage China to be a meaningful contributor to global challenges will be enhanced if we have a functional relationship with them. And it will be undermined if we have an intensely adversarial relationship. To be clear, China will only act in its interest. It's not going to take any actions as a favor to us, whether on climate or COVID or anything else. And the same is true in reverse. But if the United States-China relationship is viewed as purely toxic and purely adversarial, there will not be political space in either country for leaders to work with the other, even if it serves both of their interests to do so. And if If my words don't persuade you, just look at the record of the last year with COVID. So in conclusion, the thought that I would love to leave you with and welcome your reactions to is that America can best strengthen its own competitiveness by investing in ourselves at home. We don't need to defeat China. We don't need to destroy China to achieve our national ambitions and protect our vital interests. If we deliver the goods for our people, if we live up to our values, if we lead international efforts to meet global challenges, I think we'll do just fine in our ability to compete with China. And I deeply believe that our security and prosperity will be determined foremost by our own decisions, by our own actions, and not by Beijing's. But with that, Dr. Brzezinski, I would love to turn it back to you, and I look forward to our conversation.
All right, thank you, Ryan. That was fantastic. I encourage everyone to go out and buy your new book, Stronger. It was a really excellent read and just a very clear analysis of the U.S.-China relationship. I want to get to some of our participants' questions here, and we'll read them out for you, and then we'll see what you have to say, I guess. Tom Clark has asked, after he had read a lengthy New Yorker article about the terrible oppressive measures taken against China's Muslim Western minority people, what should the U.S. and Western response be, and what is their hope? Oh, you're muted. I'm sorry. Don't know how that happened.
Thank you. I won't play with the mute button anymore. I'm glad that Tom Clark raised this question. It's a vital question. I previously served in our embassy in Beijing. Part of my job was to be our reporting officer in Xinjiang. I've traveled across the region. I've met people in all four corners of the region, and it breaks my heart to see the repression that is taking place. And the New Yorker article was just so powerful. I think that our goal is to compel Beijing to reach the decision that it's time for them to declare victory, loosen their grip, and move on. The Chinese rationale or justification for their actions is that they believe that there is a acute terrorist threat emanating from Xinjiang. They use many of the rationales that we used after September 11th to justify their own actions in Xinjiang. And they argue that they are justified in responding to these things, that they have 5,000 years of dealing with their own people, and that they should be left to take care of the problem as they see fit. That obviously does not comport with our views and our values in the United States. And it's a serious source of tension. I don't know that there is any silver bullet solution, but I think there are some instincts that are better than others. I think it is important for us to keep an unblinking eye on developments in Xinjiang, to help the people of Xinjiang understand that we are watching, that we care, that we have not forgotten, and we're not moving on. I think it's important for the people in Beijing, policymakers and leaders, to understand that China's image in America will be colored by what is happening in Xinjiang. That Xinjiang, events in Xinjiang cast a shadow over public perceptions in the United States towards China. I think that it's vital that we continue to raise these issues and our concerns about them at every level. We need to do it privately. We need to do it publicly. We need to do it in a bilateral U.S.-China sense, and we need to work alongside our allies so that they echo and reinforce our messages. And there are, I think, ways for us to, intensify commercial pressure. We've talked about cotton issues and tomato issues recently, and also about the need to guard against exporting tools that could be used to support repression inside Xinjiang. None of these things on their own are going to solve the problem, but hopefully the cumulative weight of them will accelerate the process toward China deciding that it's time for them to adjust their approach.
Thank you. Given the recent past official delegation to Taiwan and the flower flights sort of in response from China. What do you see as the future of Taiwan?
Well, it's a great question. I wish I knew the answer. I think that the people of Taiwan, my sense is that they are sober to the risks of declaring independence. I think that they are acutely aware of the pressure that they face on an ongoing basis from Beijing. And I think that the crux of the matter is whether or not the people of Taiwan can have confidence in their ability to sustain the existence that they have now into the future, or whether they feel like time is not on their side and they just need to sue for peace and move forward. From our perspective, I think that we can't determine the future of 24 million people in Taiwan. Only they can determine it. But hopefully we can provide enough space for them to pursue the path that reflects their interests and their values. And the longer that the United States can preserve that space for the people of Taiwan, the more time it creates for, hopefully, wisdom to prevail, the situation to evolve, and the threat to dull in its sharpness.
The next question is, would you care to speak about the financial effects that the most favored nation status has on the U.S.-China relationship and whether or not it should have been removed long ago?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of analysis over the years about the effects of China's entry into the World Trade Organization. I'm not an economist, so I won't pretend to be one in our time together here. But the economists that I do speak with do make the point that American companies have benefited enormously from sales into the Chinese market, that there have been welfare gains for everyday Americans in terms of lower cost of products that we all consume. But that there have been localized, concentrated dislocations in pockets of the United States where low-end manufacturing has moved from the United States to China. And I think that it's pretty widely accepted that the United States has not done a good job of dealing with those dislocations, providing the retraining that people need who have been affected. And it's really colored and poisoned, I think, a lot of people's views toward the unfairness of the economic relationship between the United States and China.
Thank you. I'm going to try to combine a couple of these. There are some questions on sort of the U.S.-China Exchange. One is the failure of U.S.-China Exchange to bring about the desired education of probably Chinese and U.S. students in terms of their understanding of each other. And then another was about higher education educators. How are we preparing today's college students to engage constructively with China? What's your advice there?
Well, those are great questions. My general understanding is that for a long time, there was an increase in the number of Chinese students enrolling in American universities. And that has plateaued in recent years. I understand that Canada surpassed the United States last year for the first time in terms of the number of Chinese students that they attracted. I don't think that's good for us. It's not good for us economically. It's not good in terms of sort of showing Chinese people how our system works and sort of the strengths of our own country and how we live, how we operate. But it's also not good in terms of limited opportunities for American students to learn from and build relationships with their counterparts in China. There's also, I think, a long-term economic impact. A lot of bright young students from China have come here to really accelerate the pace of progress, for example, in artificial intelligence, where many of the leading papers are written by ethnic Chinese students who have come here to study. If they no longer are here, then that's a loss to us in the United States. It undermines our own competitiveness. So my hope is that over time, we will be able to rebuild a certain consensus in the United States that openness is one of our comparative advantages. Being able to be a magnet or a sponge to attract the best and the brightest minds from around the world helps us. It makes me think about a quote that Lee Kuan Yew gave when he was still alive. He was the former leader of Singapore. And he said, of course, China would like to surpass the United States. The challenge they have is that they can only rely upon their own people. The advantage America has is that it's able to draw upon the talents of the entire world. And I think that we need to remember that, not just with China, but with everyone, because I hope that we can come to the conclusion that we are stronger through openness than we are by being closed. And on the second half of the question, I don't have a good answer, but I do think that exposing our students to a variety of viewpoints on China is healthy. Challenging them to form their own views and conclusions rather than just sort of being fed the prevailing narrative is probably a step in the right direction, and hopefully exposing them to how the Chinese are explaining and thinking about the world in their own words and their own writings will also round out the picture.
Thank you. It seems that if we view the global COVID-19 pandemic as a kind of practice run for dealing with the broader and much more long-term climate emergency, China can make good case that its approach is much more effective at pragmatic long-term crisis management in collective interest rather than the short-term political fighting and favoring individual self-interest over planetary safety. Isn't it possible that the rest of the world in the coming decades will grow to see the US as more of a threat to global survival and sustainability than China?
That's a fascinating question. We'll see. I don't know the answer. I'll tell you what my instinct is, that China is the leading producer of greenhouse gases in the world by a pretty good margin. China is the leading developer of coal-fired power plants around the world by a pretty large margin. And as long as those two facts remain stubbornly in place, I'm not persuaded that China will be able to shirk its perception as being a large contributor to global climate change challenges. Hopefully, those facts will provide incentive for China to turn the corner on these things. The United States needs to as well. But this goes back to a point that I was trying to make when in my initial comments, which is that if one party is moving in a direction, but the other is moving in the opposite direction, then we cancel each other out and we're not going to make a lot of progress. And we're both going to be hurt in the process. And, you know, the COVID case is an interesting exercise because for a long time, many China experts thought that if there was this asteroid-like incident where, you know, an asteroid fell from the sky and landed on the Earth and created this huge disruption, would the United States and China be able to come together to help, you know, address it? The prevailing assumption for a long time was yes, that our own imperatives would compel us together, even if we didn't like each other. And the case of COVID proved the limits of that assumption, because even though it would have served both of our interests to try to accelerate the speed at which we developed vaccines, and that it would be more inefficient for us each on our own to pursue them, well, that's the path that we took because we viewed them in a very nationalist, competitive lens. So I understand why. I think that I'm certainly not absolving China of blame. Their early efforts to cover up the outbreak were deeply damaging, and some of the lack of transparency has been harmful. And the efforts to suggest that that America created COVID, I just find reprehensible. But here we are, and the question now is what is the fastest path to stamping out COVID in every corner of the world? My argument is that hurt feelings or not, we will get to that point faster if the United States and China are both coordinating their efforts than if we each do it alone.
Thank you. Here's a question about global businesses with a significant operation in both China and the US. Can they be a stabilizing force for the future road bumps of the US-China relations? And I think you haven't really explored that sort of commercial area or industry. What do you think about that?
Yeah, as long as American companies derive so much of their revenue from China, as long as America's leading innovators' R&D budgets are funded by revenues generated from sales into China, I think that they are going to speak clearly and consistently to defend their own, protect their own interests, and by extension, the competitive interests of the United States economy. So I do think that they present a certain break on runaway rivalry between the United States and China. One of the interesting things that we've observed is that the political heat around the U.S.-China relationship has grown pretty hot in recent years, but the economic data doesn't reflect it very much. Trade numbers are still extremely robust. Investment flows are still very strong, with the exception of Chinese investment into the United States. And I think what that tells us is that the economic logic of the relationship remains very strong, even when the political winds are blowing heavily.
Okay, thank you. This second question sort of follows, I guess. U.S. capacity is very high for innovation, and China has a very deep base of intellectuals who start their research on stolen technologies. I believe China will become a very strong technological leader. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, if a country steals technology, they can accelerate up to the edge of innovation, but it's hard to push that edge out on the basis of stolen technology from someone else. The question that I think we will answer in the coming years is whether China has the domestic capacity to really push the edge themselves on their own, and whether a strategy of greater self-reliance is going to help or hinder them in their efforts to do so. I think the verdict's still out. I wouldn't bet against the United States. I just believe that we have a set of attributes that are very difficult to match. The same country that launched Google in a garage and Microsoft in a basement is still here. And we haven't performed as well in recent years, but we haven't changed fundamentally. And so we'll see. I've bet this book on the proposition that the United States will be able to come out of this current wave of declinism stronger than it went into it, in the same way that we did during previous periods of declinist fears in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Wonderful. On that note, I think we're going to end this thing on a very positive self-reflection on our own strengths and our own abilities to innovate and lead the world. I think your book, again, is excellent. I recommend it to everyone. Thank you so much for your time today. And everybody, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you at our next program, which will be on May 16th, I believe, with Professor Kumi Smith from the School of Public Health. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.